Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Chelsea.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Everyone. All right, we've got the recording going and everything. That's great to hear. Thanks so much for joining today, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Like Chelsea was saying, my name is Emily Schaefer. I am a current PhD student at Northwestern University in biomedical engineering, but coming to you more so from my role at the National Science Policy Network, or NSPN. At NSPN, I am on the Leadership Council and specifically helping with the Public Engagement and Science Communication Committee. And I encourage all of you, if what we discussed today really piques your interest, to attend that info session, because it is a really great group of folks and provides a lot of great resources if you're getting started in the science policy space. But I am not here to talk about NSPN, really here to give our speakers a chance to share a lot about their personal experiences. And everyone is coming to us from the Union of Concerned Scientists, but their experiences and scientific expertise are really spanning a really wide range. So I'm excited to hear from everyone today. This is going to be a roundtable discussion style, so I will take a moment to introduce all of our speakers one by one and go through a handful of prepared questions, but really feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat, because I do want to make sure that we have time to answer any more specifics that anyone here is really curious about getting started in science policy. So speakers, I'll just go ahead and go one by one with each of you. I have a little bit of brief context to give our guests about your previous experiences and positions and what you're up to at the Union of Concerned Scientists. But what I'd really like for each of you to do is elaborate on any relevant science policy experience that you have, and maybe also share an example of how you've used your background or scientific expertise to influence a particular policy. So I'll start with Kevin Shen. Kevin is a policy analyst and advocate for the Clean Transportation Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In his role, he works to promote a cleaner, more equitable transportation system in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. Prior to joining UCS, Mr. Shen researched the connections between transportation, new technologies, and the workforce with MIT's Work of the Future Task Force. Kevin holds an MS in transportation, as well as technology and policy from MIT, and a bachelor's of science in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Michigan. So Kevin, I'll let you introduce yourself further.
Sure thing. It's so great, and thanks for having all three of us and me. It's an honor to be invited. So hi everyone, I'm Kevin. I guess besides that introduction, I guess the big thing about me is that I used to be a civil engineer or civil and environmental engineer. At some point in that journey, I started looking at all the code books and things like that I was about to learn through, and realized that oh, that might not be for me. And there's a whole nother flavor of how to use a technical expertise and technical analytical background in places like policy and things like that. I can it feels weird to go off on a bunch of policy experiences, but I will just say that in science policy, there's a lot of different ways to be involved. There's from the at the regulatory level, you can be the technical expert on shaping regulations and things like that, but also on the grassroots level, it being in coalition with folks on the ground and helping folks understand the technical aspects or even the other political aspects with your unique lens is extremely valuable. And that's something that I've been super fulfilled with in my state and local-ish work. So yeah.
Awesome. And do you have any particular policies that you've been working on or any particular experiences that you found really memorable that you want to share with us?
Yeah, sure thing. I can share a little bit about, so I'm on the clean transportation team, and traditionally environmental nonprofits, we focused on electrifying our cars and stuff like that. But recently things have been broadening a little more. And so like one of the next steps there is electrifying trucks and buses, which have like a little bit of a different connotation. It affects our freight industry, it affects how we get our goods and things like that, and also has major like environmental justice implications. So recently in my state work, we've been implementing this policy known as the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which helps electrify an increasing amount of electric trucks and buses out there. And it has this policy is adopted state by state. And like there's a lot of different ways that I've been involved across different states in the Northeast, whether it be in different coalitions helping with their technical analysis when they want to provide a comment letter or something. One more specific example is like being able to explain, for instance, public health impacts of diesel exhaust. And that's like a unique, like technical perspective that I can bring to a lot of coalitions. But besides that, like even like talking to legislators who like, you know, legislators have like a huge portfolio of different policies that they're interacting with. And so like being able to break down the nitty-gritty technical details of what an electric truck is and just be like, oh, cleaner air, like it's makes economic sense, it makes technical sense. Like those are important points that like a scientist's voice is needed to bring for policies like that. So that's a specific policy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Dr. Amanda Fenkell. Amanda is a Western States senior climate scientist for the Union of Concerned Scientists. She is an expert in water, climate adaptation, and environmental justice issues with an emphasis on research that informs equitable policy solutions. The research at UCS focuses on the risks and opportunities from climate change in California and in the Western United States. She's committed to advancing climate justice and sustainable water management through her work. Amanda was also a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, previously worked in the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Dr. Fenkell earned a PhD in geography from UC Davis and a bachelor's degree in international relations and environmental studies from Tufts University.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. I joined UCS in December 2022, so I'm still relatively new and learning a lot from my colleagues on how we do work at this interface. I think the only thing I'd add to that bio is that I, as a researcher and as a former academic, my work was always trying to influence policy. So I really tried to seek out opportunities, whether at the state level through the governor's office, and then most recently at the federal level, to really understand like what is the science that decision makers need, what is the pace of the decision-making process, because I think that can sometimes be at odds with the way that we're trained as graduate students and the way that we like to work and languish on some of our papers and projects. And so I think that it's been a really helpful sort of push externally to think through how to do research in a way that can inform policy, can work with those community partners and frontline communities that are more like direct advocacy. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Emily.
I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Kevin. Do you have any specific examples that you can just call out for us? Any memorable experiences?
Yeah, I'd say what happened when I was in grad school, I was in California during the last extreme drought, so like 2012, 2016. And without getting too much into the weeds, there's a set of water users, domestic wells, very small systems that are essentially outside the purview of any different level of government oversight. And so they're the ones that are really first hit when you have water scarcity and water shortages. And as this became on our radar through the great work of water justice advocates throughout the state, my work in the governor's office was really trying to work across agencies to figure out what are the policy gaps or the policy barriers and how to remove them. So whether that is like creating an exception for well drillers to come into the state so that we could get more wells drilled, creating a database by which households could self-report that they were running out of water, so that now in the most recent drought, which was 2020 to 2022, the state agencies actually has that awareness and they're able to better predict and get ahead of some of the emergencies that were making the headlines back in the last drought.
Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing. And last but certainly not least, we have Julie McNamara joining us today. Julie is the Deputy Policy Director with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Her research focuses on policies and measures that facilitate a rapid, sustained, and broadly beneficial transition of our nation's energy system. This includes anything from assessing energy, environmental, and public health policies at the state and federal levels, analyzing the resilience of the electricity system, and researching the potential implications of emerging technologies. Before joining UCS, Julie worked as a research assistant at MIT and as an environmental scientist at ERG, an environmental and public policy consulting firm serving federal and state agencies. And Julie holds a master's degree in technology and policy from MIT and a bachelor's degree in biology and political economy from Williams College. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks all for joining. It's great to be here. So, I'll note that Kevin and I both went to the same master's program, and I think it's no surprise that at an organization like ours, where we're trying to turn science into policy action, being able to think about that technical work alongside the policy implications and what those routes are, that kind of natural schooling can lead to a place like this. But it's also not the only path, right? We have many people who come to think about policy work later on, and we regularly work hand in hand with academics to help make that research policy actionable. And that's something I think a lot about in my work. Sometimes it's new research that's required to try to move the needle on something we're trying to achieve. But sometimes it's just finding a new way to communicate the science that's already been done. And more often than not, that's the position that my work finds us really focusing on. And I can think of one example has been around how hydrogen contributes to the clean energy transition across this energy system as a whole. Hydrogen can play a range of roles. It really it's a neat resource, and in that in some ways it's pretty readily adaptable to the system that we currently have. But if you look at the broader system implications, in fact, it can actually drive backwards progress in the clean energy transition. So when I've been working with policymakers on how to figure out the right role for hydrogen in our nation's economy, it often means trying to bring in that broader context, where if you were to just look at it as a one-off solution, you might come away with the wrong impression compared to really bringing that systems level perspective. And so that's one area where we're called on with our technical credentials to help inform that broader context.
Very interesting. Thank you, Julie, for sharing that as well. So I'll start to jump into a few prepared questions that I have for our speakers. And I just want to remind everyone that throughout this event, if you are coming up with any questions yourself that you'd like to hear answered, feel free to drop those in the chat here or on the Whova app as well. So a natural question that comes up when we talk about science policy is kind of the differences between being a traditional scientist and moving into that policy space. And a lot of you have already started to mention that when you introduced yourselves, which is great. So I want you all to elaborate a little bit more on this. What does it mean to be a scientist? And then what does it mean to be kind of in this policy space and be an advocate? And how do you balance the needs of or the differences between advocacy and this kind of rigorous, independent, unbiased nature of science?
Well, I think for a long time, advocacy was seen as something of a pejorative term in academic work, right? The idea that simply by nature of labeling something as advocacy or someone as an advocate, that they were taking a biased perspective, that they were abandoning their work in the scientific field, right, that you know, fully objective perspective. But I think that couldn't be further from the truth. I think, you know, our organization strongly believes there's a role for all scientists in the policymaking process, and it's understanding the implications of one's work outside the vacuum of just thinking about it as a technical finding or a technical solution, and really thinking through how science flows through the policy process. And this is very different for different fields, but it's true in every field. And so I think what's really important is beginning with the process of thinking through how one's work shows up in the broader world, and then thinking about how one's research may show up in that, and starting to engage with the questions around policy implications, and then stepping forward, right, when it's clear where there are positions, lending one's expertise. And when you know that your expertise is based on expertise, advocacy is just simply another tool of advancing your research and advancing your findings. It's not abandoning the position of science.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Julie's talking about. And I think what I benefited from in grad school was this, not being forced to question, but maybe being challenged. Like this idea that like science is unbiased is to me a little bit of an illusion, right? Like what you choose to study, what variables you put in your model, the assumptions you embed into your analyses all reflects like your worldview, your positionality, your training, right? And so that affects the way that you do your quote unquote unbiased science. And so I think that like as a researcher, it's important to interrogate what you're bringing to your approach to the discipline or the research. And I think for me, like on the flip side of that, like conducting rigorous independent science really shapes how and what I advocate for, and being attuned to including things like race and income and other equitable like considerations in the way that you think about the work leads you sometimes to other conclusions. So when you are a researcher that chooses not to do that because you don't want to be too political, whatever the reasons might be, you end up with a set of findings that is not potentially consistent with the way the world is actually existing. And so I'll pass it to Kevin.
I want to continue a little off of what Julie and Amanda were saying about how like incorporating advocacy, incorporating like how you're incorporating understanding of how your science impacts policies or people on the ground, like that only serves to benefit your understanding of your own science and like what the work you're trying to do. And so like, yeah, I guess like I'm just kind of rewording the same thing, but like, especially when we're talking, there's like a whole movement in science about community science and more participatory action research or community-based participatory research, like people call all sorts of things, but like engaging in perspectives that, you know, might be kind of brushed off in traditional science world about like, oh, that's not objective, that's just anecdote or something like that. Valuing those perspectives as like, oh, like these are real people like carrying real stories with like, you know, these people's perspectives are also like valid data as well. It just serves to make your scientific research and your understanding of the world and your impacts stronger. So
yeah, those are all excellent points. And I think that segues really nicely into my next question, which is how do we, as young early career researchers, how do we start to transition into this space? Some of you were talking about making sure that you have the expertise, and like when you have that expertise, really stepping up, which I think is a great point. But how do we really use our background as scientists to create more equitable, evidence-based policies, and what's the launching point that you see to actually get involved in all of this?
I can kick it off as somebody that's only like +3 or 4 from my PhD. So I guess I count as an early career researcher. So I would say 2 things that I guess I did. I don't know how intentional they were, but in grad school, I really sought out faculty mentors that were doing the kind of work that I wanted to be doing. And so I think that like in previous jobs and even in undergrad, I was doing the kind of community-based work, but I didn't have the training, I didn't have the skills and expertise. And I think that if you're not properly trained or like, I don't know about exposed, but like if you don't learn the way to do CVPR and PAR, the kind of methodologies that Kevin was talking about, like responsibly, you can actually do harm and erode trust. So I think it's really important to work with faculty members or other researchers and community organizations that are doing the kind of work well, and then learn. I just basically learned by doing through that project. And then the other sort of entry point for me also was I was really benefit to have NSF funding for my whole PhD. So I was able to take an unpaid internship in the governor's office, but not everybody can do that. And I do know, at least in California, state agencies have these student assistant positions. And so it probably takes a little bit of work, but figure out ways to get paid for your labor and expertise in the kind of policy spaces where you want to be intervening. So that's how I sort of came to this place of being able to work at this interface, and being fortunate enough to now be at UCS, where that is our bread and butter of the way that we think about things.
I definitely appreciate what Amanda was saying, and I don't want to leave on at UCS. Just a short plug. At UCS, we have this network called the Science Network, where we have over like 20,000 scientists, and we help support and connect folks with opportunities and things of that sort, and like workshops about how to testify at a hearing and like things like that, that give you the real like one-on-one kind of advocacy skills to bring your science into that world. And so definitely a little plug for our Science Network. But in terms of like other ways of getting into the space, I feel like something that I appreciated a lot was a lot of the times the barriers in science can feel very insurmountable, or, you know, like there's a lot of like very formal barriers of like, oh, do you have a PhD? If not, like, I don't know if you're allowed in, or, you know, these kinds of things. And so, well, something that I appreciate about academic or in the advocacy space is that like it's a lot more open, and like you can get involved at a volunteer level, you can get involved in a local issue, start out there, you can like, you know, and that to me, that was like something that I loved about advocacy space. That was a little more, you know, a little more guarded in maybe the scientific world. And I think the last thing I'll say is like, whether or not it's a technical issue out there, like transportation or a clean power system, or a better way of that water works out there. In science in and of itself, there's like a lot of policy areas that like are affecting the scientific community that like, you know, you can take action on. Like I remember one of my first experiences in science e-policy was working on like Title IX stuff going on in universities and academia. And there was like a federal bill in Congress that my grad student organization kind of like was taking action on. And so like even things like that, like it affects scientists and science in and of itself, and you can build some advocacy chops there if that's something you're interested
in. The only thing I'd add is that it's never too late to start. And it's not something you need to have taken a class in or gotten a degree in. As Kevin mentioned, UCS has resources, but also a lot of technical societies have policy arms, either some training or sometimes fellowships. That can be a great place to explore and just to talk to people who have done it to better understand the ways in which they're engaging. And then I'd also say a lot of journals often have great news and features as well as policy features. And one way to have a better understanding of how policy intersects with your area of science is to read those, to start getting some familiarity and seeing how fellow scientists are considering these policy implications.
Yeah, those are all great points. Thank you, everyone. I want to pick at something that a few of you have touched on. Julie, you mentioned, you know, finding your expertise and really knowing when to step up. But Kevin, you also mentioned, finding an advocacy opportunity that was very different than what you, or maybe your scientific expertise necessarily was. So maybe for early career researchers or for students that are having a hard time seeing where their research area fits into policy, what advice might you give in trying to explore the advocacy and policy space?
Well, I can say, I think just generally, it's incumbent on all scientists to have really interrogated how their work fits in the policy arena. I think you're at risk of doing, Amanda mentioned some of the potential harms, but it just gives such a better perspective and understanding of the work itself to have more fully thought of the broader context in which that work is happening. And so that just takes time and takes trying to look at your work in a new way. And I think it can also be really invigorating, exciting, and generative in terms of where to take research next. But I think just talking with colleagues can often be just a good place to start, if it really is a place to start. But we work with scientists in so many different disciplines, and it's not just those who seem to really have something that seems so obviously relevant to policy. There are plenty of times when something can be really niche, and yes, it's not every day it's in the news or the policy is relevant, but there are some times when that expertise is just so valued. And so understanding and taking the time to understand what that piece might be, right? And I understand I'm speaking a bit at a high level, but thinking about, I in grad school, my area of research was synthetic biology and genetic engineering, and thinking about, a lot of times that's at the lab bench, and thinking really just specifically around genetic engineering. But of course, we've seen the ripple effects of what regulations mean for that, what the philosophical implications are of that. And so I think once scientists were prompted in that field to really start wrestling with what happens beyond the lab bench, some of those policy implications really started to become clear. What does it mean to be regulated? What if you can't use this sequence? What if, right, when science is adaptive, how might one's expertise help to inform a system that isn't currently designed for this new emerging technology? Those are all different ways to start thinking through where your science fits in.
I totally echo what Julie's saying. And I think another thing that I experienced, like as a grad student, even like probably still today, is like the idea of the imposter syndrome. Like you really probably know more than like you might feel you do. And I feel like trying to get it out of your own way. I think the academy itself does a lot of it forces you to like know what you don't know, which is good, but then you shouldn't let that prevent you from weighing in on things. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is like PhDs, not that everybody is going to get one, but like it is a very niche topic. Like the whole point of your degree is to like get the piece of the knowledge that nobody else has touched. But I think what I've benefited from is like when you take a step back from that, like it's not just that niche area that I got really deep on, but like the training, the critical thinking, the systems approach, like just asking questions in a different way. Like that was one of the messages I really got during my AAAS fellowship, is because like you're being placed in an agency where you might not have any expertise or sort of relevant training per se, or at least like subject matter expertise. But I think what was clear from that year and a half where I worked at the Millennium Challenge Corporation is that even though I don't know anything about energy systems, or I don't know anything about Sierra Leone, which is like the project I was most close on, my training and background and the way that I think about things was still a valuable contribution to the way that we were trying to get the work done. So I think that's what I'd say on that point.
Yeah, I was trying to find a way of phrasing that, so thanks, Amanda. Because for instance, on our transportation team, we have a couple of scientists and analysts on our team, but like one of them did a PhD in physics, like very basic science. One of them did like chemical engineering, like kind of sprinkles their perspective in sometimes, but like I think a lot of the benefit of like coming from a scientific background or having that technical background is like what Amanda was saying about like the processes with which you can analyze a problem, or, you know, like develop a perspective or stay grounded in like what is technical or things like that. Those are like transferable skills that I wouldn't want scientists to shortchange themselves about. Like that's what you learn. That's what you learn when you learn to go into one field or something like that. So I think that's one point. And like on the like, don't let yourself get shortchanged. Like there's a lot of bad actors out there who will use the technical expertise with a lot lower of a bar of like how technical they should be or things like that. And so like you don't want to leave your scientist voice and your scientist power on the table. Last thing I will say as well is like, of course, scientists have like a great lens to the world, but of course it's always important to be humble about like if you're confronted with a community perspective that doesn't match your technical perspective, it's like it's on you as a scientist to figure out like how does that bridge, or, you know, where does that come from? So that's something else I'll add.
All very great points. Thank you so much, everyone. Now, all of you, as we've already mentioned, have a science background and have transitioned into this advocacy space. So what was any of the big surprises to you as you were moving from the very technical, researchy kind of minded type of work and then getting into policy and advocacy? And what do you wish that you would have known before you made that transition?
I can say I do feel like the culture has run so deep in academia to distance oneself from policy, from appearing as an advocate, as you brought up earlier, that it still was somewhat unsettling at the start to think about work as an advocate. And I wish I had known from the outset that it's just doing research in service of policy aims, right? I think we are all very, very trying to stay true to the science. One of the things that really attracted me to this organization was I knew that it held those, like, we can get to inconvenient answers and we won't, change the answer. And you have to reckon with what the research shows as it is. I really appreciate that. I think that was something I wasn't sure about in the advocacy space, but in fact, it's very integral to it. That said, both Kevin and Amanda brought up something that I've also found to be very additive to my former training, is that science is, of course, it is not objective. It is very human informed. And we really risk keeping some of the most important perspectives, key parameters, and insights out of it when we try to believe otherwise. And it's too bad, but I've found that the advocacy realm is where those are being best brought to bear. And I'm not saying perfectly. There is a lot of room to grow, and continue to get better. But that's where I've seen it best reflected so far. And I think there's a lot of work to be done within academia on this front, because it shouldn't be just in the realm of advocacy where we see these additional perspectives and we get this fuller consideration of the work as it is. But that's been a great addition.
I guess what I would say also is that like I had a job before grad school that like proclaimed to do science to policy, but I would argue that it was really much more in the science and like policy sometimes. Like it wasn't like, I think we hesitated to do sign-on letters the way UCS was willing to do it. I think, and maybe this is because it was 10 years ago and it was like the climate and the intellectual climate and the willingness to engage on issues has changed a little bit. But I think that it's sort of on the responsibility of the scientific community to really think through like what are the consequences of you not speaking up or speaking out. Like that IPCC report just came out. Like, I think you can't just keep talking about the science and the bad outcomes. You have to be willing to contribute to the kind of future we all want to be having. And I think that, like, to Kevin's point, there's definitely like bad actors. There's definitely people that like weaponize their training and their technical expertise in service of like certain interests. And I think organizations like UCS and others, like, I actually feel like we have a lot of autonomy and a lot of intellectual freedom within like the scientists and analysts group. And I feel like sometimes, like, when I was on the job market, that was like, well, you won't have intellectual freedom if you don't stay in the academy. That's really where you can like think and write without consequence. And that's obviously not even true. So I think like being more expansive in the kind of careers and sort of organizations as you think about like how you want to use your training, whether it's policy or advocacy. And I think what's great about organizations like UCS is we really have all of the components. We have policy people, we have advocacy people, and we have science people. And so you don't have to be an expert in all of them, right? We can work as a team and collectively figure out what is the best way to influence, or what is the right research question to be asking. So I think that's it didn't even occur to me that UCS was like a career option for me when I was finishing up. And I'm so lucky that I'm here now. But I think that like seeking out opportunities to learn about the alternative academic career pathways that are not going to be exposed to you when you're in grad school, because the incentive structure is to like create more academics, even though there aren't jobs for them. So I think just like being creative, and I think anybody that's come to this panel is probably like in that space of questioning and trying to figure out like, how do I use the training and science I work on for other outcomes?
Well, my huge plus one to that of like, when I was in grad school, I felt like there was only one way forward: get a PhD, become a professor and everything. And like being at UCS has broadened my vision of all the possibilities to use like your beautiful talents and skills and stuff like that. I think I want to kind of go back to something that Julie was referring to earlier, which was that like there are so many different versions of what being a scientist advocate looks like, and so many different places in the chain where you could really like use your skills, whether it's like even like of course like research, basic science research is also important, and like that's on one end of the chain. And also like other things like, you know, translating that research into something that's something for policymakers, it's another chain. Like like knowing the political landscape of who needs to hear your message and stuff like that is also another part of the chain. And to me, that's been something that's been super interesting for my like curious scientist brain, is like, what does it mean to be strategic with like how you communicate your technical insights? Where's your voice most needed? You know, like things like that. And to me, as somebody who went into science to like drill down into something deep and learn something, like engage with it, learn all the details, like learning advocacy space, there's so many different things to learn. So that fed my curiosity a lot. Yeah, I'll say that. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but yeah.
No, those are all really great points. I really like that. And we had a great question come out of the HUVA conversations about specifically mental health when you're working in like the advocacy science policy space, which I think is a great thing that people should think about as they're considering a potential job in advocacy. Is that, you know, I think you all can obviously speak to this way better than I ever could, but there is kind of a conception that being in advocacy comes with some hits to your work-life balance, or maybe things like compassion fatigue, or just a generally pretty high load on your brain to do that sort of work. So do you have any tips or ways that you manage that as being people with a career in this space?
I'll just say briefly that like, I don't identify as a grassroots organizer. Like that's not what I work on. I think sometimes when we think advocacy, we think grassroots, and like burnout is real, overextension is real. And so I can't pretend that like that my experience and like way of existing in the world is anything like what the grassroots advocates are facing, because they're really on the front line dealing with these things. I do think that like my mental health in the academy was much worse than it is in this science policy advocacy space. So like, I think like if anybody's struggling with mental health issues, like in school or just out of school, like there are other ways of existing and working in the world that do not trigger some of those issues. So I think that like mental health and burnout exists regardless of whether you are working in advocacy or policy or in academia. And I think a lot of it comes down to the individual setting boundaries, getting the tools and skills to make sure you're protecting yourself so you can better show up for the work you want to do.
I can add something as well about, like, I've also like struggled with mental health, but like in grad school, and like similarly have found that like the nonprofit or the advocacy world has been liberating in that regard. But of course, everything comes with different struggles and challenges. Something I want to uplift is the whole connection between climate change and mental health, and that's something that a lot of folks at UCS talk about. It's like like it's quite sad to be working on policies and not seeing the change you want to see, like or seeing all the bad act or seeing all the opposition or being on the front lines of all of that. That can be quite degrading as well. But I feel like the way I've approached it is that, I don't know, kind of like the ending of that one movie. I forget what it's called. Oh, it'll come to me. But like
Don't Look Up.
Yeah, kind of like
Yeah.
Don't Look Up. Whereas like, even if like there's a lot of things happening out there in the world, a lot of like being in advocacy, it feels like you're in the fight with good people. And that's like something that's like a comforting fact for me. So yeah.
Yeah, I just very close to that. I'd say yes, I have sometimes a better understanding of the intransigence of the vested interests we're up against. That's less good. But I also feel fully empowered to every day have some outlet for those feelings and for the magnitude of the challenge ahead of us. I know at least that it's an outlet for taking it on. And I think that's one of the reasons, I'll go back to the fact that it doesn't have to be a choice to be a scientist or an advocate. There is a role for scientists to be advocates while they remain right in that core function, either whether it's in academia or research institutions, even within companies. There's still always a role, and it really can be, in fact, quite liberating to try to figure out how to bring those skills to bear in these large challenges that we face today. So I think in many ways, it in fact can be a lift, not a drag.
And I just want to quickly.
Having a kind of.
Oh, sorry. I'll just say quickly.
Mental health issue.
I don't know if that person is trying to speak.
Yeah. We'll go ahead and.
Sachin, did you have a question?
Yeah, I
think you can go ahead, Amanda. Oh.
Let me share.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm just thinking that mental health issue is one of the most serious issue nowadays. There is one of the solution to find a kind of such issues, maybe life balance. Are you listening me?
Yep, I would totally agree, Sachin. And I think that that's what I was going to say, is that like what is helpful in the current position I have is like having a shared sense of purpose, shared values. So I think that the affirmations you get when you work in a place like that is really uplifting despite all the hard things that we're all working on. So I think like you're saying, it is one of the biggest challenges we all face. And I think trying to find a place where your mental health is not worsened by your job is a really critical thing to be thinking about.
As you say, in academia, is a kind of issue that you face, mental health issue. there's any kind of solution that you have to just tackle such type of issues?
Within academia?
Yeah.
I think, you know,
in
what,
academia.
I think there's something to what Amanda was just saying, that ability to talk to others about it, what you're seeing, both for good and for ill, being able to engage with community is really important on that front. Both to be able to have acknowledgement of what you're facing, or right, what different people are facing, but also to potentially have leverage for change. I think when so many things can feel like they're written off as one-off or individual problems, in fact, are shared by so many, and by uniting in dialogue and conversation and understanding that these, in fact, can often be shared challenges, instead of the forced siloization that so often happens within academic circles, within research groups. There can be real identification of potential interventions for helping, for either boosting, there's so much great research into this, but boosting community, being able to just share in collaboration with your colleagues, that it's not a zero-sum game, that there is room for being a person within your work and within the sciences, and just understanding that you're not alone, so key.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, thanks a lot.
I wanted to add one more thing to that question as well, which is, this is like more speaking on behalf of me as an individual than on the organization, but I'm inspired by a lot of like the grad student unionization efforts out there, and how people are sharing their stories with each other, and being able to call out some of the structures that keep a lot of that cause a lot of mental health issues for grad students and things like that. For example, like how advisors are kept accountable towards how they treat their grad students, things like that. There's a lot of different ways that in academia that mental health can be improved by things like that.
Great, thank you for that question. If there are any other questions, feel free to unmute or drop them in the chat. We're keeping an eye on those.
Emily.
Hi, go on ahead.
I just want to express our gratitude to you and to your team for a great presentation today on behalf of GARD.
Well, thank you. These people are really the stars of the show, but thank you.
All of you are, so thank you. Thank you for your time.
Hey, Emily. Hey, everyone. So here's another question. What would be some routes that people may need to take in order to get into a science policy career if they've been only knowing about academia and then they just found out today, oh, I can possibly get a career in science policy. What do I do now?
Well, I mentioned a few professional societies can be a really great place to start looking for resources, because they are often targeted at your given field of research. But I think all of us have mentioned that it's not just about your technical research. And in fact, it's important to remember that the skills go far beyond that and can be applicable in a variety of fields. That said, I feel like there can often be some perception in the broader world that it's easier to pick up on policy than it is on a technical field, or it's easier to pick up on the social sciences than in the technical sciences. And so I think it's important to bring humility to this process, but it's not insurmountable at all. There's reading you can do. There are great trainings, from one-offs to series. I think many organizations and schools have science policy initiatives of some form or another. Those are great areas where people have begun to do this work, and it's a great way to get engaged, to better understand the contours of what it means to do science policy, to think about the different careers that are out there.
I would say as well, something that was a useful but not very emphasized thing to learn in grad school for me was having practice with communicating, whether it be policy issues or technical issues, and communicating that to like a non-academic audience, whether it be like learning how to like digest something into a blog or write a technical comment, which like everyone, like, you know, those are open for like anyone, you know. Those kinds of skills definitely got me a lot of points for in terms of career, like making a career shift and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but the UCS Science Network was not a thing I knew about when I was in grad school. And I feel like it probably would have put me in contact with other like-minded, like early career researchers sooner. Like my own cohort and like friend group at UC Davis, where I did my PhD, like we're all very concerned about the science policy interface, but I sort of lucked into that group. So I think if this is like a thing you're interested in or questioning, like seek out groups like we've been talking about where you can sort of have peer mentoring and peer knowledge exchange. Like that's been the most helpful for me as I go through my career, because sometimes people that are plus 10 or 15, 20 years, like a lot of my faculty mentors are faculty, right? So they only know the universe in which they exist. And so I think trying to figure out like, where are the people with your training or with your expertise, leveraging their degree to do something that's more interesting to you is a really critical way to start thinking about alternatives.
One thing I'd add, I think a lot of us within UCS and the broader, science policy world are always happy to talk. If you want to reach out and learn more about what a career like this might look like, I feel like sometimes my inbox looks like, a home for wayward academic souls, right? Who are thinking like, what does this mean? And what are these alternatives? And I think people are often excited to talk because they're so familiar with how under-discussed this is within academia, right? You know, Kevin mentioned that it so often feels like there's only one approved path, and it's somewhat, it can be seen as admitting defeat if you consider anything else. But it's just broadening opportunities. And I think it's really great to reach out to people and find out what their work is like. It may not be for you, but that's something else you'll have learned, right? Or it sounds great and you're interested, and those connections can lead places. But especially, it doesn't have to just start with a job, right? It can just be fact finding. What is a day in the life of a career that's based in science policy? And if you're showing up to a panel like this, you've got it. You're doing it right.
Yeah,
I'll just I'll just say one more thing quickly. So for those of you that are like with a PhD or finishing a PhD, there are state level versions of what I did with the AAAS. So there's the CCST, I think Idaho, there's a bunch of states that are doing that because they recognize the gap in training for PhDs. So like the salary is usually equivalent to a postdoc. So I used to like call my AAAS like a policy postdoc. So it's a way to sort of like build your way out of the academic space, but still be doing it with other people that have similar experiences.
Awesome. All wonderful advice. I think we had maybe someone else with a question. Otherwise, we also had a request, Amanda, to explain a little bit more about what AAAS is and maybe that policy fellowship. And can you elaborate on these state fellowships as well? Maybe what the differences are between them?
Yeah, so the American Association for the Advancement of Science is AAAS. They have like a flagship program. I think it just hit its 50-year anniversary this year, called the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And they do congressional, judicial, and legislative placements for PhD, you have to have your PhD in hand. So I finished in July and I applied that following November. So I actually did an academic postdoc and then I went to this AAAS postdoc. And it's kind of like med school where they match you based on your interest and your expertise with a federal agency. So I was in the executive branch one, I think is the biggest one. And like as a social scientist, I was actually kind of an anomaly. It's very like STEM focused and STEM forward. So I think that what I also appreciate is they pay you like a GS salary, right? So I think there's a lot of conversation around like underpayments of postdocs, underpayments at grad school, and it was a way to level up like plus 50K for my grad school, still a salary in a matter of years. So just for like the lost income of being in graduate school, that's another way to think about like other career trajectories. And the CCST, the California something Science and Technology Fellowship, is a parallel one. It just has you intervene in the state in the assembly in California. I don't know about the other ones, but they all have websites. You can figure out the application cycle, network with people that have done the fellowship or are in the fellowship as a way to think through like whether it's a good fit for you. But it's, for me, it was like a really like obvious stepping stone. Like when I started grad school, I was like, I want to get that AAAS fellowship because I never wanted to be an academic. So yeah, obviously, as Julie said, email me if you have questions. I'm happy to like talk about it and do one-on-one mentoring.
Great, we've got 3 minutes left with our wonderful speakers. Any last questions from the group?
Well, I think we've answered everything from the messages that I've seen. Thank you so much, Julie, Amanda, Kevin, and Emily. I really enjoyed hearing from you all and always love to hear about UCS and NSPN. I hope to see you all at the next session. This will be about for scientists to be posting on social media. So many of the topics that we've been talking about for advocating, you can reach a larger audience through social media. So let's keep this conversation going, and I hope to see you all there.
Thank you all, team. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a great